everybody, it's Mr. Wagstaff. Cool stuff to talk about today. Alright, so today we're going to be talking about life at the turn of the 20th century, which is from the 1800s into the 20th century, which is the 1900s. Because remember, the century is always one more than whatever the year is. So it's getting ready to start the 20th century here, which is the 1900s. Alright, cool stuff to talk about today. I think you're going to like this. We got cool stuff, disturbing stuff, awful stuff, cool stuff, new inventions, innovations. We got all types of stuff we're going to get through today. Alright, so one of the first things I want to talk about today, skyscrapers. So, if you remember, we have mentioned this thing called the Bessemer process, created by Henry Bessemer. Alright, because you create something cool, you name it after yourself. The Bessemer process is a way of making steel much easier than it had been done for the previous 1,000 years. Alright, now that steel is readily available, there's a lot of things people want to use it for. One of the main things is the fact that these cities have gotten very densely populated because of urbanization of the factories, and there's just nowhere else to build. So they're going to start building up. They're going to start making skyscrapers. This here is the first skyscraper, excuse me, this is the first skyscraper ever built in America. This is in St. Louis by Louis Sullivan. And it's either Lewis or Louis. I honestly don't know. We'll say Lewis. We'll go with that. Lewis Sullivan built this skyscraper called the Wainwright Building. So this picture here, now, if you can tell by the cars that this is probably taken in the 1930s or the 1940s. So this building was already relatively old by the time this picture was taken. And you can see there's other buildings here. Like, shoot, this one here in the back might even be taller. But this blew people's minds. Because iron was really brittle. You couldn't build up, it'd be too much weight, it would just collapse. Iron or steel allows you to build, this building's like almost 10 stories tall. I'm counting, if you count up, it looks like 9. You might count that as a story. I don't exactly know how they count it, but this is like a whole city block, or part of a city block, I guess you would say, stacked on top of each other, and it's perfectly safe. This is the first super tall building that they made using steel, and they realized, you know what, it's just as strong, we could just make it higher. So there ends up being a huge boom in steel manufacturing and building buildings that is really tall. So I wanted to show you this picture. If you've never seen it, you're either probably going to think it's cool or it's going to be really disturbing. This is a super famous picture of men eating lunch on a skyscraper as it's being built. This is one of the more famous pictures probably in American history. It's a little out of the time period because you can tell how high up they are. I think this is on the 69th floor of the Rockefeller Plaza that's being built in New York City in the 1930s. So, but still, there's not a lot that has changed since then. So, from the 1900s to the 1930s. So there's no safety equipment. If you fall, you gonna die. So this is an extremely famous picture. The type of people that it takes to work on these skyscrapers is, it's crazy. It's terrifying. I will point out, because I wanted to show you this picture since we don't talk about skyscrapers a whole lot in class. After this, since they're building up and the cities get more dense. But this particular picture, and I happened to look this up because I wanted this picture, and I did not know this, that this picture was staged. They typically just eat down on the ground, or not all together, but there's photographers there that actually got them all together to have this picture taken. Like, they're not concerned about it. I mean, they're up there all day. I don't know for a fact that they would eat lunch on the ground, but just them all being out there together, they asked them to go out there and get a picture like this. So this is a little bit staged, but these are the real steel workers, and yeah, there's no safety equipment. They don't wear safety equipment. Like, why wear a hard hat? You're going to fall and die. That's the logic. We know now, yeah, but there could be a guy above you, 20 feet above you, that drops a big wrench and hits you in the head, and then you fall off the side. So that's why you wear hard hats now. So it's not that wearing a hard hat on a skyscraper is going to prevent you from surviving a fall, but hopefully it helps keep you from getting knocked out if something happens and makes you fall. So that's the reason they wear hard hats. All right. So, but steel and they're starting to build cities up now. All right. Who are these two guys? You probably know their names. You've probably heard of them, and you've never seen a picture of them. And I don't know why. Because I looked at the picture and I was like, I don't know if I've ever seen them before. This is Orville and Wilbur Wright. This is the Wright brothers. I don't know why I thought they were a lot younger. I just assumed they were. They're not. So Orville and Wilbur Wright, they blow everybody's mind because they're the first ones to fly. Asterisk next to that. All right, and I'll tell you the cool story with that. So Orville and Wilbur Wright, very smart guys. They're kind of crazy. You have to be to make airplanes. Very, very smart, obsessed with flying. They actually had a bicycle shop in Ohio. That's where they were born. It's where they're raised. They had a bicycle shop. So bicycles back then, just like today, there's high-end bicycle shops now that you can make a lot of money if you own it and know what you're talking about. That's what they did. They would make custom bicycles. They'd fix bicycles. Not your huffy Walmart ones. Bicycles are expensive with a lot of moving parts. It's kind of like a clock. So that's what they did. And they understood. They were very good mechanically. So they understood the science behind flight. Leonardo da Vinci had basically figured it out. You can look at a bird and see how, but the problem is you have to get going fast to start. So if you build an airplane, you have to get going fast, but they just don't have engines powerful enough at the time to like pull you down a runway like we do now. Like the combustion engine had just come out. They're just now fine tuning it. So the question is how do you fly? So they built this thing. And they build this in Ohio, and I have a feeling this picture is probably taken in Ohio. So they have an engine on it, and it's got propellers, and they think it can fly. The problem is that you have to get it going fast initially. Well, how do you get it going fast? Well, here's what most people did when they were trying to fly at the time. They just jumped off a cliff. Because you go fast and, we'll fly. But usually something goes wrong, and they hit the ground, and everybody dies, and it's really horrific. So Orville and Wilbur Wright, they need to be able to go fast. They want to jump off a cliff too, because use gravity. That's the best way of getting to go fast. All right, and then see if everything works. So they're in Ohio. All right. They also don't want to die. Where they want to go is they want to go to the beach. They go to the beach and they jump off a big sand dune. All right, because it's really windy at the beach. Now to help them out, you jump off a sand dune and it crashes. You might just break an arm or a leg. You're not going to die because you're hitting sand. At least that's the thought. So they need to go to the beach and jump off a sand dune at the beach. Well, here's the problem. They're in Ohio. Ohio is landlocked. There is no beaches. So what they do is they take their plane here and they pack it all up and they travel down to North Carolina. They go to the Outer Banks of North Carolina, a place called Kitty Hawk. All right. And they reassemble the plane there and they test fly it there. It is a massive success. I want to say their first flight is like 45 seconds, which, you're like, oh, that's not that much. You flew through the air for the first time in human history and for 45 seconds. Now, here's what's really interesting. They called out like the newspapers and everything out there to point out, hey, we're getting ready to fly. They take off, they fly, it's successful, hooray, the Wright brothers, everybody high fives them. It's fantastic. They get all over the news that humans have mastered flight, and everyone's like, yeah, woo! And then it's like, now what? Like, what do we do now? All right, because the whole goal was to learn how to fly. Now that humans can, what are we going to do with it? There's really very little going to happen with the airplane until World War I, when somebody's like, let's put a machine gun on it. Once you get into war and you can create any new invention into a war machine, all of a sudden a lot of money gets thrown into it, innovation gets thrown into it, and it becomes much more advanced. So the reason I've been kind of, I don't know if you've noticed that I keep saying they're the first ones to fly. They probably were not. As crazy, there's another dude, and I forgot his name, and that's kind of symbolic of this whole thing. He's easy to look up. So there's a guy, I want to say it was only like 3 or 4 months before, who built an airplane and flew. He was, I don't even know where he was. It's somewhere in America. And he flew an airplane. And a whole bunch of people saw it, and they're like, that is awesome. And then the Wright brothers do it, and they get famous for being the first ones to fly. This is because the Wright brothers had it written in the newspaper. This, like people can go back and these guys like, yo, no, we saw him fly. He's got a plane. He can go out there and show you again. But because he didn't like let anybody know he had done, oh, I should look up his name to tell you. But yeah, so pure coincidence, they didn't know each other. So there's been some drama there. Speaking of drama, there's also a little bit of drama between Ohio and North Carolina over who gets to claim the right of this glorious thing that happened. Well, North Carolina's like, happened here, we claim it. Orville and Wilbur Wright were like, yeah, but we're from Ohio. And Ohio's like, yep, they're ours. So to this day, there is still an argument between North Carolina and Ohio over who gets to claim the Orville and Wilbur's massive achievement as like their own. North Carolina on the license plates still say first in flight. North Carolina's like, it's us. Ohio has clearly won this debate. North Carolina, like we have lots of cool stuff in North Carolina. We have pirate ships and all types of like lighthouse, all types of stuff. But we try to steal the first in flight thing because Ohio, their license plates, they say birthplace of aviation. And the National Museum for Aviation, all stuff airplanes, is in Ohio. This plane is in Ohio. So that they win. All right. Another cool innovation that happens. All right. So there's this dude here named George Eastman. All right. This is all dude right here. All right. So he is going to develop a new type of camera. It's called dry film. Basically what he has in his hand is dry film. It's ruined if that's actual live film because it... Anyway, so when you get your picture taken, you had to pay somebody like $100. And they came over and took your picture and you had to stand there perfectly still like this for like, minutes to have your picture taken. And they had to go back to all this complicated stuff, develop it, come back, give it to you. If it's a crappy picture, you that's just it because you can't afford to have another picture taken. George Eastman thinks he has a revolutionary new idea. It is basically like flash photography, basically instantaneous. It's what George Reese was using when he made the book, How the Other Half Lives, is this instantaneous pictures that can be taken, all right? George Eastman develops it. And he goes to try to sell it to all the photographers because that's how you make your money. You sell it to the photographers and they all love it and hooray, high five for everybody. However, all the photographers boycott him. They say, nah, that's way too easy. If people see how easy it is to take pictures, they won't want to pay us anymore. So no. So all of the photographers get together and try to put George Eastman out of business by refusing to buy this new camera because it's so much better. It's kind of a weird thing to do. Well, George Eastman says, nah, forget that. And he turns around and he creates something cool. Creates his own company. Now, when George Eastman creates his own company, what should he name it? If you said, Mr. Wycliffe, he should name it the Company of Eastman, you would be correct. That is what he should name it, but he doesn't. Because the company he makes, you've probably heard of. Kodak, the camera company. Now, as I say that, a few years ago, Kodak went out of business because Kodak makes really good film. With the advent of digital everything, people don't really use film anymore. So Kodak's gone out of business. I do still believe that Kodak is a household name. The company, Kodak. I do believe that it is still a household name for cameras. I hope so. Maybe not, but I grew up with it. But so he creates the company Kodak. And man, he's got a great slogan. You press the button, we do the rest. All right. So what he does is it cost $1 to buy this camera. Today, $1 is probably 50. I don't know. Money isn't exact because not everybody had money for stuff, and this is a completely unnecessary expenditure. So it's hard to say how much $1 is. But apparently, you could buy this cardboard camera here for $1 and take pictures with it. And once all the camera is done, you send it in with 15 cents. Which, how much money is that? It's manageable. All right. And they will develop the pictures for you and put a new roll of film in your camera and send it back to you. Completely cutting out the need for any type of photographers. Right here is an actual photograph of one of those. This looks a little nicer than cardboard. I mean, it's got screws in it. I guess it could be so maybe this is made out of cardboard. Maybe the 1900s cardboard's a lot nicer than what I'm expecting. But yeah, so what you're going to see now in history is a lot better photographs. Action photographs, a lot more common photographs. Basically, anybody we talk about now, that they can have a picture of them. So yeah, George Eastman comes out, creates the company Kodak, drastically improves my ability as a teacher to show you pictures of stuff. All right. So speaking of people, this here, yeah, great segue, Mr. Wagstaff. Speaking of people, all right, we're going to talk about African Americans at the turn of the century and what they were struggling with. All right. Spoiler alert, basically the same thing they've been struggling with for a long time. Racism. All right. So it was slavery. Once slavery ended, massive racism in the United States. At the turn of the century, there's different attempts of how you're going to deal with racism moving forward in the African American community. Most of America completely is oblivious to the racism that is happening in the South. Most of white America. If you live in Montana or places like that, unless there's a exoduster from the Homestead Act there, you may have never seen a black person. So the majority of black people at this time at the turn of the century still live in the South. And if you don't live in the South, there's no internet or stuff. You probably have no idea what the experience is for black people in the South. And if somebody told you, you really just might be like, yeah, I think you're exaggerating a little bit. Can't be that bad. Like, there's no way they're just like, no, you can't do this. It is absolutely like that. They're like, yeah, you're telling me there's people in America that because of the color of their skin, if they're just at the wrong part of town at the wrong time of day, they can get like murdered by a group of people, and then like nobody ever goes and investigates that. That's not true. And there's black people in the South be like, no, seriously, that's like literally what happens. And like, we're like, I'm sure it is. And it's like, even the people that aren't racist, it just seems crazy because lynchings are a thing. Lynching means murder, and this would happen in the South. And I'll explain more details of how the separation in the South was done intensely and aggressively. This is Booker T. Washington. Booker T. Washington was actually born a slave. Booker T. Washington, and there's another guy we're getting ready to talk about, W.E.B. Du Bois. Not Webb Du Bois, it's W.E.B. Du Bois. Both of these men, two African-American men, very smart. What they agree on is what African-Americans need to do is focus on education. So if African-Americans can become just as educated as white America, if not more, life will get better for African-Americans. So you would think W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington, who are both strong, well-known African-Americans at the time, who won't focus on education, that they would get along. Not really. Very different ideas, and here's why. So Booker T. Washington, he comes up with his idea on how how black people are going to combat racism. What's really sad about his idea is that he's using logic, and you would think, hey, maybe, if racism is a thing, here's how we combat it. It's not going to work because he's trying to use logic to combat racism, which is inherently illogical. Here's what he says. Booker T. Washington, the guy here, he was like, once black people have the same level of education and have the same amount of skilled jobs and contribute equally to society as white people, because keep in mind, black people were not allowed into the same schools all right, as white people, so they didn't have the ability to learn these skilled positions and stuff like that. So a lot of times, black people have the poorest possible jobs, and there's no way to move up because there's a lack of education there. Black people 100% are the poorest part of the population, all right, especially in the South, all right. The poor, they got paid less than white people, and it was really hard to move up because there weren't opportunities. So Booker T. Washington says, look, as soon as black people, we can find a way to become as educated and we can contribute equally into society as white people, racism will go away. Once white people see that black people can contribute equally, racism's going to be gone. It's going to be fine. Let's focus on education and, you know, overcoming these hurdles that we have as a people, and racism will go away. Booker T. Washington's a great guy. He ends up founding the Tuskegee Normal and Industrial Institute, which is like the Duke or Harvard for African Americans, even though W.E.B. Du Bois, who we're getting ready to talk about, actually graduated from Harvard. So Harvard was one of the first anyway, Harvard may not be the best example. Very, very distinguished school. The problem that we'll eventually see. So this is a lot of what Booker T. Washington works towards, is trying to end racism. Like, just look, everybody can contribute equally. There's no differences. Like, using logic is what they end up realizing is once a black person and a white person equally contribute in life. If that white person is racist, or either one of racism go either way, but if the white person is racist, which is pretty much what happened because there was a whole white supremacy movement, that if the white person is racist, they're going to look at that black person who contributes equally and be like, no, you don't. No. It's not as good as what I just did. It's not. Even if it's verifiable proof, that is just as good. Racism is the absence of logic, is the belief that one race is superior to another. Just like, not as good. And you can't combat illogical behavior, which is racism, with logic. And so while Booker T. Washington's heart was in the right place and did motivate African Americans to become more educated in order to fight racism, there were a lot of good things that came out of his ideas, but unfortunately it did not really help with racism at the time. So here is a picture of W.E.B. Du Bois with this sweet stash. So W.E.B. Du Bois, he is the first African American to graduate from Harvard. All right. If you ever become go to school for history, you'll read some of his books, or at least excerpts. A very, very smart man, uses a whole bunch of words. You're like, that's not a real word. And you look it up and you're like, oh my gosh, that is a real word. Like, that just seems like a whole bunch of vowels or a whole bunch of consonants strung together. So very smart man. So W.E.B. Du Bois is going to disagree with Booker T. Washington on just try to be equal in society and society will get better. W.E.B. Du Bois says, black people were slaves for like 300 years and they were bred, that black people were bred like animals to have a superior human being to do farm work. It's horrific. But you know what happened? They bred human beings to have a superior human being. And because of this, so African Americans make up about 1/10 of the American population at the time. W.E.B. Du Bois says that African Americans are the most talented 1/10 of the population because of the breeding that took place in the slavery times. So black people shouldn't strive to be equal with white people. Because of the most talented 1/10 of the population, black people should strive to be leaders in society. Now, this is not hey, let's go get back at white people. That's not what W.E.B. Du Bois is saying. He's like, let's move forward from now. Black people should strive to be the leaders of the United States in order to make the United States the greatest country on earth. Lynchings are taking place in the South for being black and being in the wrong side of town. How do you think the society is going to revolve or respond to an African American saying, hey, maybe a black guy can be the president? You might get lynched for just joking about that. That's an exaggeration. I don't want to lynching again, illogical, violent things. I don't want to throw that out there too commonly. But yeah, it did not get taken. Like, people were like, what? I mean, just the hatred that was in people's minds. Like, no, 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 no. We're not going to let that happen. So much so that W.E.B. Du Bois lives up in Buffalo, New York, because it's real close to Canada, where he's getting as far away from like where lynchings and stuff could take place. And he lives right next to Niagara Falls. So his idea that African Americans should fight for their own advancement in society, all right, gets referred to as the Niagara Movement. All right. So the Niagara, and here's a photograph, and look, you got a Kodak camera here taken. It almost looks fake, like a backdrop, but that's the real Niagara Falls. You finally get good cameras that can take like almost action shots. A lot of African Americans here in this picture, and I'm sure every one of these guys is super famous at the time for something. W.E.B. Du Bois is here, right here. So W.E.B. Du Bois is a huge supporter of trying to better the lives of African Americans in the United States. There's a lot of crazy stuff going on. There's poll taxes and literacy tests and this thing called a grandfather clause. Like, there's so many things trying to keep black people down that the Niagara movement is an initial start of black people fighting for the advancement of black people. The appropriate term at the time was colored people. The Niagara movement is actually the beginnings of what will be referred to as the NAACP. And we'll talk about this a whole lot all the way through really the rest of American history. The NAACP, which will come out of the Niagara movement, is called the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. And W.E.B. Du Bois is responsible. This is not a, retaliation to white people at all. This is nobody else is looking out for black people. Black people need to look out for black people to try to level the playing field as much as possible. All right. So I had mentioned a couple of times about trying to end racism, end, these horrible things that happen. I just mentioned poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses there, stuff that W.E.B. Du Bois wants to fight against. Let me explain to you how deep racism is in the United States. All right. In the South, and there are places in the South where the majority of people are African American. They only make up 10% of the total population in America, but that is concentrated in the South because that's where slavery was. So black people have the right to vote. 15th Amendment gives black people the right to vote. Well, there is a focused effort to keep black people from voting in the South. Voting is power. Let's take that power from the black people, is what the white supremacy was just the thing. It was that white people should run society. White people were superior, that it is the dominant race at the time. Like that is the belief system. It is, today we look back on it and it's incomprehensible, which is a good thing. That this is only 100 years ago. This is not that long ago. We have made massive strides, but at the time, if you called somebody racist, that wasn't an offensive term. That is just like, yeah, okay, I'm racist. Let me explain to you what was done to keep black people from voting. Step one, a poll tax. You have to pay about a nickel. We'll say a nickel. You have to pay a nickel to vote. Now, the poorest part of the population is black in the South. And these poll taxes usually only existed in the South. All right. So in order to vote, a black person would have to pay a nickel. This is basically the equivalent of dinner. You can either buy dinner for your family or you can vote. That alone, just having a poll tax, means you had to pay to vote, kept black people from voting. So it disproportionately affected black people because they were the poorest part of the population and were the least able to afford having to pay that tax, right? So it's a poll tax. Now, if that was it, it may not even make it in here about how racist it is. We may mention it, but maybe not in a survey. Of course, like, but Mr. Wagstaff, it affects everybody. Everybody's got to pay the poll tax. Okay. We're going to come back to that in a second, all right? Because yes, on the surface, it looks like everybody has to pay the poll tax. So the next thing is a literacy test. You had to prove that you were literate, right? So what does literate mean? So you can read or write. That's what I thought it was too. All right. So a literacy test, everybody that votes has to be able to prove that they can read, that they're literate. Well, here's the problem with that. Guess who doesn't have access to schools? Black people. The literacy rate in the African American community is much less because there weren't schools necessarily for black people. So a literacy test is directly geared towards black people to prevent them from voting. I also want you to take a look here at this literacy test. This is what it takes to be literacy. Well, and let me point out, this is a bullcrap test. This is completely subjective. All right. So like draw a line after the first letter after H and draw a line after the second letter after J. So you're basically knowing your letters. Okay. Now granted, if you read that, but they go through, basically do math problems. All right. What's the next number in the row here? So you have to do some math. Number 20, spelled backwards, forwards. If you just write backwards, because that's backwards, forwards. All right. They could disqualify you because they could say, nope, nope, nope. We wanted you to spell backwards, comma, forwards, period. That's how it got subjective. That regardless of what you wrote, they could say you couldn't do it. And that's all it took. You cannot vote because you are not literate. That's the type of stuff that would happen in the South. Now, you're like, oh, that's crap. But don't white people still have to take the literacy test? Yeah, they do. And you're like, okay, how is this racist, Mr. Wagstaff? If white people have to pay the poll tax and white people have to take a literacy test, how is it inherently racist? I want to say you're going to laugh, but you might just be horrified. It's because there's this thing called the grandfather clause that also gets passed in these states. The grandfather clause says if your grandfather could vote, you don't have to take a poll tax or a literacy test. In the 1890s, who's the only people that had a grandfather who could vote? White people. Why couldn't black people's grandfathers vote? Because they were slaves. So if you're white in the South, you don't have to pay a poll tax. It's free. You don't have to take a literacy test. You've never been to school, so you can go vote. But if you're black, you do. It effectively keeps black people from voting. And before you start thinking, oh, I bet that's just down there in Georgia and Louisiana and the deep South, it ain't. It's the whole South. Here's North Carolina. North Carolina, and these are the years that we created a poll tax in 1900, literacy test in 1902, grandfather clause, 1902. North Carolina, Virginia. The capital of the United States is right here. But Virginia does it as well. This is not just a deep South thing. Racism is prevalent across the board. And it's absolutely devastating to African Americans trying to gain any sense of rights or representation in the government. So tomorrow we're going to start talking about segregation and what's happening in the South. And you're like, why can't black people fight against it? You fight against stuff by voting. You cannot vote in the South if you're black because they make it nearly impossible. If they don't want you to vote, you're not going to vote. So we're going to pick up there tomorrow and talk about some of the segregation and how that was put in place tomorrow.